This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 2, video number 6. We just talked about the Missouri Compromise because as the United States gains new land out west, all these conflicts emerge as to whether those new territories, when they become states, whether they will become free states where slavery is illegal, or they will become slave states where slavery is permitted. So the Missouri Compromise is the first of many compromises that adds Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and draws this line, this parallel line, 3630, and says all future territory that becomes states north of it will be free and south of it will be slave states. Now, this does not totally satisfy anyone. And we're going to see the big goal with all of these, why they'll add two states at the same time, is keep in mind the Senate is based off of the number of states there are. So remember, there's 2 senators for each state. So in order to keep things kind of fair and even in the Senate, they wanted to keep the number of slave states and free states equal so that one side didn't gain power over the other. Because this issue was becoming more and more bitter as time went on, as the abolition movement gained more traction, as people opposed slavery more strongly, but also as slavery became more profitable. This was the issue that divided the United States deeply, and as we'll see, leads to the Civil War. The next attempt at compromise is called the Compromise of 1850. Again, new land is becoming states, and we're going to see a different kind of compromise. First, California becomes a free state. They kind of, go along with this Missouri Compromise line and say, all right, this area, New Mexico territory, can be open to slavery. However, they also added what's called the Fugitive Slave Act. This was a law that upset pretty much everyone. This law said that any slaves that escaped from the South and went up north to these free states, they must be caught by any Northerners and sent back. Otherwise, those Northerners would be in trouble. They could be arrested and punished for not stopping the slaves from escaping. Remember, slaves are trying to escape to Canada, where they will have freedom permanently and be actually safe. Because in the northern states, they're still not safe, and that's the point of the Fugitive Slave Act. So this outraged a lot of Northerners, especially abolitionists, the idea that they could be held responsible for returning slaves to a state of slavery. The slave trade in Washington, D.C. was also outlawed. So they are not really importing new slaves at this point, but they are obviously allowed to buy and sell these human beings amongst themselves, and slavery is continuing because obviously slaves can have children, and any children of slaves was the property of those owners, including slaves conceived out of rape by the masters with their slaves. The next attempt at compromise is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was upsetting to many because this, again, kind of goes against the Missouri Compromise idea. It says that the territories of Kansas and Nebraska can decide for themselves whether they want slavery or not. This concept is called popular sovereignty, meaning the people have the power to decide. So, because people want to influence this decision, a bunch of people rush to Kansas. They move there so that they can participate. So, you have people who feel really strongly about this issue all showing up in this space at the same exact time. So, of course, there is violence. It gets the nickname Bleeding Kansas. In fact, a man named John Brown shows up there. He's an abolitionist, but super radical, and he murders some slave supporters out in the woods. He chops them up with his sons. We'll talk about him again in a minute. An important Supreme Court case decision. This is another huge one that you must know. It's called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave, and he and his wife sued for their freedom. Why did they do this? His slave owner, his master, took him up to a free state. He lived in a quote, free state for a while, and then was taken back down south. Now, technically, it was a state that didn't have slavery, So he argued, I really should be free to go. I lived in a free state. However, the Supreme Court decides that he does not have the right, first of all, to sue because he's not a citizen, he is legal property. And also that really, looking at these guidelines, there's no such thing as free states because the government cannot take away the property of people. So no matter where a slave owner goes, they still have the right to their property. So this undoes the Missouri Compromise. It says slavery is legal everywhere. This decision is devastating to abolitionists, and it's horrifying and repulsive. Abraham Lincoln hated this decision. So people who were not even totally anti-slavery still had a problem with how this was being applied. Going back to John Brown, after this, he later decides to use an even more radical tactic. So you'll see why he's so controversial. He decides he wants to lead a slave uprising, a insurrection. So he raids a federal armory, a place where weapons are stored, with his sons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to try to start a slave uprising. Unfortunately, the slaves apparently did not get the memo, and he was left there, and obviously federal troops came in and captured him, and he was executed. This really divided a lot of Americans. Southerners were terrified. Here's a white man who tried to start an insurrection, a slave uprising, which is their worst nightmare, while Northerners see him as a martyr for this cause. So let's really summarize the causes of the Civil War. These are events leading up to it, but what's at the root of this? Slavery. Slavery, slavery, slavery. All economic, social, and political power in the South was absolutely tied in to this highly profitable system. The economy is based on slavery. Right, this phrase, King Cotton. Cotton is totally integral to their society. It is the most valuable institution, most valuable sector of the economy other than American land. Slavery is right behind it. Social power, the idea of racism, that whites have superiority over blacks, even those who don't own slaves. A small fraction of people in the South actually owned slaves. However, these same men fought and died to protect this institution because it gave them a sense of social power. And political power because most of the people who did have political power in Congress positions, senators, they also were the people who owned slaves. So owning slaves is tied in to having access to power and money. They were willing to fight to defend this. Now, that is the core of it, but let's also talk about the other issues that we had been seeing throughout American history, even before this. Sectionalism. From the moment the 13 colonies are founded, the North and South become extremely different. We saw in Washington's farewell address, he notices the North and South are really different. Why? The North, it's colder, the soil is rockier, so they don't have large-scale farms like they do down south. So they actually develop manufacturing. There's rivers that can help develop manufacturing. They have all of the financial institutions, right? Wall Street is in New York City. All the trade ports are in Boston, New York City, etc. All the railroads that are starting to be built pretty much exist in the North. The North is pro-tariff because they have manufacturing. Remember, tariffs protect manufacturing by causing people to purchase American-made goods. And by this point, most of the states had abolished slavery. However, in the South, the climate is warmer. These warm coastal plains down south allow for plantations, economies based on the sale of cash crops. They are anti-tariff. Tariffs do not benefit them, but make their goods more expensive. And they have really little manufacturing, few railroads, and a slave-based economy. So again, this is called sectionalism. People feeling more allegiance to their section of the country, feeling more proud that they're a Southerner than just being an American. This issue of states' rights we've talked about before, the idea that states should be able to do what they want, that states should be able to manage their own affairs, that they should be able to nullify federal laws if they don't like them, because they feel the federal government is encroaching upon their sovereignty. And the straw that breaks the camel's back is the election of 1860. This is what triggers the start of the Civil War, as most Southerners did not vote for Lincoln.